For those of you new around here, I'm Paul Dillon. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I recently shot a video on how to shoot time lapses. Shot a video on how to shoot, that sounds funny. Shot a video on how to shoot time lapses. I got a couple messages on social media, a couple comments down below on that video on how to edit a time lapse, how I edit a time lapse. I thought it'd be a great idea to shoot this video on how to edit a time lapse. Now there are some important things to note. I understand the audio is not great when I do these talking head shots here. I understand the lighting's not great. It's super DIY, but it's all these excuses that I used to tell myself that kept me from doing these videos. I understand I'm not gonna have a great professional studio like Peter McKinnon or MKBHD or Unbox Theory, but I refuse to let those excuses keep me from making great videos, and you should do the same thing. Don't let your excuses, don't let your lack of camera or your lack of lenses or your lack of gear keep you from making great videos. Be yourself, create good content, and screw the excuses. Do it anyways. So with that being said, we're gonna head to the beach. We're gonna go over some of the in-camera settings that we talked about in the how to shoot video. Those settings are really important because they're gonna help in the post-processing. So let's head to the beach. So before we talk about how to edit a time lapse, I think it's important to see the workflow in setting up a time lapse because there's some in-camera settings that can actually help you with the post-processing. But first we need to get to the beach. We're here at a little spot. I'm ducked down because it's kind of windy. I hope this is even making a difference, but got my Rhino set up here in the tripod. Even though we're shooting in RAW, and you can technically adjust the white balance afterwards, it's still a good idea to not put the camera in auto white balance. You don't want, that's like giving somebody else creative control over your photos. You want to set the white balance and you can always change those in post. Another thing to take into consideration, what I talked about earlier in the how to shoot a time lapse, would be your focus. Same with not leaving the white balance on auto. We don't want to leave the focus on auto. So it depends on if you want your foreground element in focus or your background in focus. And in this case, we're going to do a view of Newport, I believe that's Newport Beach. So I want my foreground element not in focus. I want the background in focus. So set that up now. Now we'll be using the Lightlapse app that will be controlling my Rhino. Same settings would really apply if you were using aperture priority. So if you watched my last video on how to shoot a time lapse, then you know what I'm referring to. If not, I'll link that below. You should go watch that first before watching this. There's some tips on how to shoot a time lapse, and I personally love aperture priority, but today I'm going to be using the Lightlapse app for that Rhino. Now that we're back from the beach, let's jump into how to edit a time lapse. I'm not going to walk you through the entire editing process of each individual video because I think that's kind of subjective. They're really based off the individual, and the last thing I want to do is to teach you how to edit photos that look exactly like mine. One thing I can tell you is I am a purist. I don't like to do any kind of crazy color shifts or edit too heavily. I do some minor adjustments, which we'll kind of dive into a little bit here in a moment. I like the foreground, the background. I like the environment to really speak for itself. I don't like to replace sky and do all these crazy, really heavy editing, because again, I'm a purist, but I digress. First thing we want to do is open LR Timelapse. LR Timelapse is technically free. You can edit up to 400 photos and it allows you to export a 4K video. So if you're not using Premiere Pro, or Final Cut to export your time lapses, LR Timelapse will let you do up to 4K. I personally pay for LR Timelapse Pro because it allows me to do as many photos as I want, and if I should feel the need to, I can export up to an 8K time-lapse, which is really rad. Now the A7 III that I'm shooting on doesn't allow me to do 8K. It only shoots 6K raw files, but I have it if I need it. LR Timelapse can look a little scary, but it'll make sense to you in just a moment. We're essentially gonna work from top to bottom, going left to right, and this will all make sense in just a moment. So on the left, we have where our files are located, so you just wanna open your time-lapse. Now this time-lapse was specifically shot for this tutorial. The first one we have here is Keyframes Wizard. This is gonna allow you to set certain photos as keyframes, and then LR Timelapse will go in there and make the adjustments to the photos in between those keyframes. So by default, LR Timelapse will kind of give a guesstimate based on this blue line here, which is your exposure. Now I was using the Rhino Lapse app, which is very similar to aperture priority. So this line going up and down, this is pretty typical for a Holy Grail time-lapse without an expensive bulb wrapping kit, especially considering I have the sun coming in and out of the clouds so much. So we're gonna set our keyframes. This blue diamond right here recommends a keyframe. You can add and take away keyframes if you feel there needs to be more. You can also use the slider to give it more keyframes, but I personally will just let LR Timelapse kind of default to what it wants, and I will watch the time-lapse back to see if I need to add keyframes. So watch this time-lapse back, see if there's any really crazy adjustments in the light, or maybe the white balance is off in some of the photos, which I thought there was towards the end. It does look like the time-lapse, when the sun goes down, the white balance does look a little, so I'm gonna set another keyframe here. So we simply just click the blue diamond to add another keyframe. The next one on the top is Holy Grail Wizard. Now the Holy Grail Wizard, if you notice, it's the opposite of what your exposure is, and what it's doing, you notice these little red triangles here. What it's doing is it's making gradients in between each photo, and I'll kind of explain what that is and why it does that in just a moment. You have these rotate and stretch. Depending on how bad your exposure was, it'll never be perfectly, but you want to try to get both of these ends as close to this yellow line, which is quote unquote 0 exposure. So above would be overexposed, below is underexposed. I personally like to underexpose my time lapses so that I have more detail in the highlights. So after we have our keyframes down, we have the Holy Grail Wizard where we want it. The next option is going to be to save. So this will save the metadata to all the files. It'll save the keyframes there, it'll save that. And then next, again, working from left to right, top to bottom, our next option here is drag to Lightroom. So you want to make sure that you have Lightroom open. Once Lightroom is open, you want to make sure that you go to import. The shortcut for that is Command-Shift-I, which will move to the import window. You just want to make sure that this here says add, so it's ready to add your photos. So we're going to Command-Tab back over to LR Timelapse. Once I left click and drag this, I'm free to kind of drag this folder wherever I want. So we're going to Command-Tab back over to Lightroom, and just drag all your photos into Lightroom. Make sure all the photos are selected in the sequence that you want to do your time lapse, and simply click import. Otherwise you can't edit those photos. Now you'll notice some of these photos have stars here. These are actually your keyframes. In the interest of not having to go through every individual photo and find those keyframes, down here in the right corner you have this filter option. Next to filter, you can simply filter out just the keyframes. That will tell Lightroom, hey, I just want those keyframes, however many you've set in LR Timelapse. Now if you hit D on the keyboard, that'll bring up your develop window. I'm not going to walk you through the entire editing progress of each individual photo, because again, it's really subjective. I'll show you some basics that I do, but have fun with it, adjust your own way. One thing to keep in mind though, if you're into heavy editing, LR Timelapse is going to have a harder job of doing all those incremental adjustments to each individual photo, so just keep that in mind. One thing I will always start with is removing chromatic aberrations and enabling profile corrections, especially considering I'm shooting on the Zeiss Batis 2.8, the 18mm. It does have some lens distortion because it is a wide angle lens, and I always notice that this does add a little bit too much vignetting, overcorrection rather. Now as far as cropping goes, I always leave this as the 3:2 crop that it was shot in camera. The reason being is because I like to crop in Final Cut for the final edit, because I feel like I have a little bit more freedom with setting keyframes, zooming in, zooming out, and kind of moving the photo. So I like to crop in camera, but you can absolutely create your own crop here. So I'm gonna run through some editing and then we'll get to the next step. I'm pretty happy with that photo overall. As you can tell, didn't do too much crazy editing. Right now I'm at the beach and there is a lot of mist from the water, so I did add a little bit more dehaze than I typically do. I'm pretty happy with this photo. It doesn't look too saturated anywhere. As you can tell, these rocks are out of focus because my main focus for this, I wanted to be the background. So I wanted the sun and the clouds to be in focus and this kind of to be out of focus. So that's why if we zoom in, you'll notice these aren't super crisp because I have the background element. Now there's two ways to batch edit. When you're using LR Timelapse, the best option is to only do one photo at a time. So remember earlier when I talked about the gradient filter in LR Timelapse? If you right click this and go to develop settings and copy and paste the photos, it actually doesn't copy LR Timelapse's gradient filter. So the photo, the adjustment of light in between each photo won't be great. So the best option is to just sync the keyframes, and I'll show you exactly how to do that. So right here, if you notice in the left corner, I have this first photo selected. If I shift click, that way these are both selected. Up here in the right corner, you'll see this S for scripts. And then this option here says LR Timelapse sync keyframes. And what that will do is it'll sync all of our adjustments from photo to photo, including the gradient filters. The reason why I love LR Timelapse is because when I first started doing time lapses, I would actually do this all myself. I would have 400 photos. I would batch edit, which is essentially just editing one photo, copy and pasting to every single photo. And I would go in individually based off of the histogram here between photos and try to get them as close as possible. And that was a pain in the ass. So the fact that LR Timelapse exists is amazing. So this is where you're gonna make minor adjustments in between each photo. Maybe the exposure is off, maybe it's a little not as bright as the first photo. That's actually looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. So we will make sure photo 2 is selected, shift click photo 3. Up on scripts, we're going to sync keyframes. And I do notice this one's already looking a little blue in the preview. So let's take a look at that. Yeah, it's a little blue, so I'm gonna adjust the white balance of this photo slightly. So I wanna bring out the warm tones of the beach. That's looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. Don't think I need to adjust these. I might bring down the shadows a tad bit because the sun's out in the clouds, just to make that water pop a little bit more. Pretty happy with that. So again, having the third photo selected, shift click the fourth photo, go up to scripts, and sync the keyframes. Now we're gonna continue to do this through all the rest of the photos. So click on your fourth photo, make minor adjustments if need be, sync the keyframes to each individual photo. Now that you've got your photos edited the way you like them, you're gonna hit G on the keyboard, which is gonna move you back to the grid. Now you wanna make sure that you select all these photos. You can do them numerous ways, but I'm a huge keyboard shortcut guy, so Command A is going to select all. If you hit Command S, it's going to save the metadata to the files. So if we go up here to metadata, you'll notice save metadata to, what? Metal data? You know, rock band. You wanna save the metadata to the files. So Command S will save the metadata, and the metadata being the editing in the photos, the white balance shift, all the adjustments we made to those individual photos. Let's Command Tab back over to LR Timelapse, and working from left to right, the next option here is Reload. This will load all those photos in. You'll see here the small adjustment I made to straighten the photo. And remember when we first started, this yellow line is your exposure. You'll notice this blue line here is underexposed. So when we edited them, this is where the blue diamonds being the keyframes, this is where now our exposure is. And you can see it's a little bit more straight because we've edited those keyframes. After we've done the reload option, which reloaded all the metadata from Lightroom, the next option here is auto transition. Now, auto transition is you'll see in a moment all these lines, and you'll notice the keyframes, instead of being up and down like it was before, it's now a somewhat of a straight line. That's because it's adjusted the exposure between each of these photos. The next option is visual previews. Now visual previews is gonna take a little while depending on your computer speed, because it's gonna make all those small adjustments in between each individual photo. So whether you adjusted the exposure slightly or maybe the shadow adjustments, it's gonna run through each one of these photos and make small incremental adjustments, which you'll start to see here in just a moment. Now that visual previews is done, you'll notice this visual deflicker is no longer grayed out. This is going to make those really small adjustments to smooth out the exposure in between. So if we play back the time lapse, you'll notice there's a lot of flicker, sun's coming in and out. The visual deflicker should help with that. So I'm pretty happy with that overall. So we're going to choose visual deflicker. Now there's a ton of options here. You'll notice this green line is where it's going to make the smoothing. More often than not with day to night time lapses, I usually have to go all the way up to 50, and you'll notice when I change the slider over to 50, this green line is much smoother. You do have some accuracy if you wanted to do less of adjustment, default or more. I usually keep this on default. Every now and then I have to do more, but you can always do a multi-pass. So if you do it once and you feel like it could just be a little better, you can always refine it. So we'll go ahead and add the visual deflicker now. We just need to click apply and let it run through. And you'll notice all these lines come up because what it's doing is trying to make all those incremental adjustments in between each photo to make sure that it's one smooth time lapse. Now that our visual deflicker is done, play this back. Notice it looks much better. Less flicker. Now there's some light changes on the rocks because the sun is coming in and out of the clouds, can't really get rid of that. But the thing to note is it's not as bad of a flicker because this went through and kind of smooth. I'm actually pretty happy with that. But if you wanted to, you could always click visual deflicker and go ahead and do it again if you think it needs a little bit more smoothing, but I'm pretty happy with that. So we're going to Command Tab back over to Lightroom. Now that we've filtered in just the keyframes, we want to filter in the whole sequence. So go back to all the photos. I want to make sure that you'll notice just the keyframes are selected, the ones with the stars. So you want to Command A or select all, and before we save the metadata to the files, now that we've done all those small increments in between each photo, we want to read metadata from files. You want to make sure that you have all your photos selected, otherwise it won't do this correctly. So if we go to read metadata from files, you'll notice after this loads all the data, you'll start to notice the picture previews will change because each one of these has those small adjustments in between each one. Now that the metadata has been read from all the files, you'll notice the previews are starting to change here. At this point, we're ready to export. Now, you can use LR Timelapse to export your video, but in this case, I'm gonna use Final Cut, so I'm just gonna export these into a folder as individual files. I'm gonna create a folder for this individual time-lapse. So to create a new folder for a Mac, it's Command-Shift-N, and I'm just gonna name this edited because these are the edited photos. Now the shortcut to export all these photos, again, we wanna make sure they're all selected. Command-Shift-E is gonna be your edit window, and this is where you'll simply edit these files. Now, I personally will just export these files as JPEGs. I won't do anything too crazy to these. I'll make sure the quality is set at 100. I will not resize these because again, we're gonna use Final Cut, or you can use Premiere if you wanted to. We're gonna use Final Cut to pretty much do everything. So I'll name this and then just choose your folder. You can put these wherever you want, and we'll go ahead and just export these photos into our file, and then we'll hop into Final Cut for the final process. Now that we've got all of those photos or all of your time-lapse photos, we're gonna open up Final Cut and I'll show you how I've kind of dropped them in really quick ways to do them in Final Cut. So if we hit Command I, locate our photos, and again, going back to earlier, I made that folder called edited, so I know exactly they're gonna lie. Those photos are gonna be right there in that edited folder. Did I just say folder? In the edited folder, we're gonna Command A to add all those, and then just import all. I think that was a redundant step because if you hit import all, it should import all those photos. All right, now we have all of our photos imported into Final Cut. So we just want to left click and drag the first few of these. And if we hit Command A, that will select all those photos. The letter E on the keyboard will bounce all of these into your timeline. So if we hit Command A again, this will select all of these photos. If we hit Control D, you'll notice this change here. This will allow us to change the duration of all of these photos. So we want them one frame, click enter, and now you'll notice that all of these have bounced down into one frame. Now to make things easier, right click and make these all into a compound clip. So no matter what you do, you can move this around, and this is your entire time lapse. Now to clean up my timeline in particular, I like to delete all of these. So if we hit Command Delete, it will remove all those photos, and now when I bounce in actual video stuff, I don't have to thumb through all those photos. You'll notice it's still the 3:2 aspect ratio and it's not 16:9. So this is where you can get creative with it. If we go over to this panel here, you'll notice that we have scale. 120 is 16:9 aspect ratio. So the reason why I scale it to 120% here is because I can add keyframes, I can move this way, I can move this way. Whichever way that you can kind of add some more motion. Now I was using the Rhino, which added enough motion anyways, but I might kind of zoom in a little bit towards here. Oh, that's funny, you can see Cody's drone in this picture. So I might add a zoom. You can also go to crop here and do the Ken Burns effect, right? You can do these adjustments whichever way you want. You have some kind of freedom here. I just feel that you have more freedom in post as opposed to doing the crop in Lightroom originally. And that's pretty much it. That's how you edit a time lapse. There's probably a ton of different ways out there. This is just the way that I do it with LR Timelapse. If you have any questions, feel free to leave some comments down below. I'll be happy to hop in the comment section and answer those for you. You can also reach me on Instagram if you want to send me a DM. My email is there. So if you want to shoot me an email, you have specific questions for this time lapse. Most important part, get out there, start shooting. You're never going to get good at time lapses unless you make a ton of mistakes. So get out there and start shooting. And remember, 1% better every day.